past 2 days I got to go kayaking. If you know me, you know how much I love kayaking. It's actually my number one personal tourist goal coming to Chile was to get to kayak some good rivers, and I've met that goal. I got to paddle the Liacura and the Rio San Pedro yesterday. Now the Rio San Pedro is it's big water, so it's a lot of water moving down this river. And what a lot of water means is when you get to rapids, there are big waves, like huge 10, 12, 15-foot waves, and they're exploding. There's white water everywhere. It's super, super fun. Even when it's smooth and there's just big, we call them haystacks, just big rolly waves, it's still like 2 and 3 seconds up and down on every single one of these. It's like riding a big, soft, wet roller coaster. It is super fun. And the Rio San Pedro is something called a pool drop river. So what that means is that it's kind of flat, deep, wide for a long, long time, and then it gets narrower, and then all of a sudden it gets very steep for a section, could be any length. In this case, I think the longest rapid was about 50 meters, and so it's almost like a big ramp of water, and there's rocks in it, and there's changes in it, so that there's waves and holes and all sorts of features to either go for or go around. And so this is kind of, you wait in these pools until you get to the drop, and then you paddle to the drop and you go over and you have a blast. The whole time going through these waves, I had to keep closing my mouth because it was wide open in a big grin, and I'm giggling like a schoolgirl, but I'm getting water in my face and I don't want to swallow the river. So I had to, while I'm paddling, keep reminding myself, close your mouth, breathe, close your mouth, breathe, because I was having too much fun. And there's one drop on the Rio San Pedro. I don't know its name. I'm sure it has one. It's kind of right in the middle of the run, and it's the biggest rapid on the river. It's a class 3 plus, maybe 4 at higher water drop, which means that it's fairly long and fairly technical. This drop was big. It was maybe 20 feet high and fairly short, so that means it's steep, right? And it's technical because there's big, big boulders in the middle of the drop, and a couple of them are exposed, so if you hit them, you're going to bounce off and out of control and maybe hurt yourself. And there's a couple other ones that the water is pouring over, and when it pours over, there's something we call a hole on the other side. When you go over a rock into a hole, usually you get stuck there and churned up. It's kind of like sitting in a washing machine. In big water, it's like sitting in an industrial washing machine. And so, pretty technical drop. Now, we made a mistake. I was following another guy, and he went through, made it okay. And so I started going. Now, the second person in line pulled off into an eddy at the top of this rapid, which is what we all should have done. Because whenever you get a rapid you don't know, you get out of your boat and you scout it to pick your line first. But she was in this eddy, he had made it through, and I realized all of a sudden that there was nowhere I could go but down this rapid. And so I had to make a commitment to it. Because when you're doing whitewater, if you're going for a rapid and you don't commit yourself to it, you get into trouble. If you get scared and freeze, or you back paddle, or you do anything like that, you lose your momentum. And so when you hit these features, rather than plowing through them and going over them, you get stopped by them. In big enough waves, we're using little tiny boats. In big waves, you get flipped end over end and disoriented, and it's not a good thing. So I had to make a commitment. Once I realized I was past that point of no return where I couldn't turn back, where I couldn't get to shore, it was a matter of scouting it and running it from my boat. So maybe not the best thing, but making that commitment was, once I knew I had to. It turned out I actually got a really good line through it. It was thrilling, it was exhilarating, it was the most fun I think I've ever had in a boat. It was the biggest waves on the biggest drop I've ever run. Super awesome fun. And running drops like this, it's a common theme for me. It reminds me of my faith. It reminds me of faith in general, because when we're called to commit to God, a lot of times He sends us into the same kind of situations. Now God generally lets us scout a little bit. He helps us prepare, and He gives us what we need to get a good line through whatever situation He's going to put us into. There's that saying, God will never put us into a situation that we can't get out of with His help. I believe that's totally true. And so, forget the part where I forgot to scout, and think about the part where I had to commit. God will call us onto a path, and we make a decision, yes, I'm going to follow that path, or no, I'm not. And we say yes, and usually there's some sort of lead up to the path. For me, for this trip, it was going to the airport and getting on the plane, and the days coming up to that. So I'd already said yes to God, but at any time, I could have backed out. I would have felt like crap if I did. I knew I wouldn't have been following God's call, but I could have. It was possible. But really, once that plane took off, there was no going back. I was going to land in Chile and be immersed into a totally new situation, and that's the way it was. And when we commit to God, God calls us to do that too. There's some point in that commitment where we pass a point of no return. Let's say it's a relationship with someone we know needs some help, someone we know needs God's love. When we make contact with that person and we start building that relationship, we've passed a point of no return. If you, in a ministerial relationship, maybe it's a friend who's had a loved one who dies who needs your comfort, if you start giving them that comfort and then you stop or you back away, all you're going to do is hurt them even more, and you haven't followed God's will. You've done God and this other person a disservice. Or let's say, you feel called to serve the homeless. You're walking down the street and there's a homeless person who needs help, and you pause for a minute and you say yes to them. You've passed the point of no return. You can't go back anymore. You can't take 2 steps backwards and then walk by that person and ignore them like we usually do. Now you're committed to doing something holy and loving for that person. Whether it's buying them a cup of coffee, having a conversation with them, getting them to a shelter, doesn't matter what. God will decide that, but we're committed to it. And so our faith calls us to make these, I call them elite commitments. I say elite because it takes a lot of courage. It takes the kind of courage Peter had. We go back to this story one more time, when he got out of the boat and walked on water. There was a moment when Peter was kind of probably, unless he vaulted himself out of the boat, but I seriously doubt he did, when he was maybe straddling the deck of the boat, so he had one foot on the deck and the other foot hanging over the edge, and that was his point of no return. The next thing he did would have been lift that other leg over and let go. And once he did that, there was no turning back. There was no getting back in the boat, and there was no not walking on water. Maybe an even more powerful and more important story for us is Jesus in the garden. In my last talk about trusting God, I talked about saying that prayer, Father, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus, in the Passion, the Last Supper, kind of that whole time in his life, had that lead up to following God's call. And that lead up can be scary. I know when I'm heading to a big rapid in my boat, I'm very nervous every single time. Every paddler I know usually is, even if it's a familiar one, because anything can happen. And so Jesus probably had similar feelings. He was probably scared about what things were going to be like, and about how everything was going to happen, and the pain he knew he would face. And at the Last Supper was kind of like when we're at an airport saying goodbye to someone. It would have been a similar feeling to that. And then Jesus went off to be alone with his closest friends in the Garden of Gethsemane. And his prayer was, if this can change, please let it, but not my will, but yours be done. And shortly after, Judas came with the guards to come and get him, and that was the point of no return for Jesus. That was the point where he could have somehow gotten out of that situation or gone through the whole thing. And so he committed to us to that point of no return. And so in return, we're called to do the same thing for each other in service and love.